So Astro Bot took home Game of the Year for 2024. That's a pretty incredible feat just considering the competition it was stacked up against, whether it be the fantastic Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Metaphor, Black Myth Wukong, or the Elden Ring DLC. The Game Awards has been running since 2014, and over that decade, a platformer title has never won Game of the Year. This is almost always action-adventure title. Now, Jeff Keighley's Game Awards isn't the only outlet to hand out Game of the Year. There are a numerous amount of outlets out there that do their very own Game Awards, but the official TGA is in fact the most popular. However, they've only been running for 10 years, and it's quite interesting to actually look at all of these other outlets. Some have been running since as far back as the 80s. And looking over all of the games across all of these outlets that have been giving away Game of the Year awards, it's not very common for a platformer title to really ever take home the gold. And if it is a platformer title, it's usually almost always Mario. During the late 90s and early 2000s, platformer video games were the forefront genre. That quickly changed towards the end of the PlayStation 2 and Xbox life cycle and going into the 360 and PlayStation 3 era, with first-person shooters, action-adventure, and big-scale RPGs taking the front seat. In modern times, the only developer that is constantly pushing out big-budget platformer titles is of course Nintendo with Mario. If people are looking for a 3D platformer or just platformer fixes in general, then you pretty much have to pay attention to the indie space. The big-name developers that used to be known for platformer titles back during the PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, or PlayStation 2 era have now since moved on to bigger budget, more action-adventure orientated titles. So in 2024, to see a AAA status platformer title coming from PlayStation winning Game of the Year is in fact a really big deal. But most importantly, in 2024, it tells us that gamers still care about platformer video games outside of Mario. Astro Bot is absolutely a case of PlayStation going back to their roots, developing a video game that is similar to the games that put them on the map in the first place, the likes of Crash, Spyro, Sly, Jak, or Ratchet. Now, we're still receiving Ratchet and Clank games, though they don't come out all too often, as Insomniac's focus is more so on Marvel video games nowadays, as they simply just generate more money for the company. It is definitely nice to see that Sony are at least trying to go back to their roots with something entirely new. It's also the business side of Astro Bot that's really important here. Sony is a business, and that means that if something isn't generating profit for the company, we simply won't see a continuation of it. For the modern AAA gaming industry, games are reaching astronomical budgets. Yes, that was absolutely pun intended. We're starting to see some game budgets go above and beyond 200 million US, with incredibly long and dragged out development times. The standards, expectations, and just what can go into a video game has increased tenfold compared to what we were seeing during the late 90s and early 2000s. Back then, we were used to developers following up with a sequel about a year to 2 years later, and in some cases, even in a matter of something like 8 months. Now, it's absolutely the polar opposite, where the expectation is that a sequel for something might take around about 4 years at the very least. So if we look at something like Astro Bot, a AAA platformer in 2024 that began development in 2021. This means that there was a 3-year period of development time. It had an estimated budget of anywhere from 50 to 70 million US. It was reported at the beginning of November that Astro Bot had sold a total of 1.5 million copies, which we can assume with a figure like that means that the game is already profitable for Sony. The other interesting statistic here that was officially shared by Sony is that 30% of people that purchased this game hadn't actually purchased any other first-party games from PlayStation in about 2 years, meaning that there was something specifically unique about Astro Bot that convinced 37% of people that weren't interested in any other prior first-party games to go out of their way and purchase this one. I would say it's likely because this is a platformer title. People still care. Now, you might be thinking 1.5 million copies over the course of 2 months isn't huge, especially with some of the absurd sales figures that get posted within the first week of some AAA video games, whether it be anywhere from 3 to 5 million copies sold week 1. And especially stacking Astro Bot up against something like Super Mario Odyssey, selling 2 million copies within the first 3 days, 12 million copies in the first year, and about 28 million current copies sold. A totally different circumstance though. Mario has been established for an incredibly long time, perhaps the most iconic video game character ever. And outside of a few exceptions, if we're looking at the masses, Mario releases are generally the only time that modern gamers tend to really care about platformer titles. Better comparisons to use here would be both Sackboy: A Big Adventure and Ratchet & Clank: A Rift Apart. Sackboy, which released in 2020, launching on both PlayStation 4 and 5, sold a total of 1.5 million copies by the beginning of 2022. So already, Astro Bot, which is kind of basically a brand new IP, this is Astro Bot's very first major video game. Otherwise, in the past, he acted as basically a tech demo for PS5, and he also had a VR installment, is already performing way better. In Ratchet & Clank, which released in 2021, it had a 3-year development cycle with a budget of 81 million copies sold, an estimated 4 million total sales across both PS5 and PC, with a confirmed $145 million return. You can see, with the current 3-month time frame that Astro Bot's been out for, this has been an incredibly successful and very profitable venture for Sony. Remember that Christmas is coming up, and this is the time of year where console sales go through the absolute roof. A lot of kids will be acquiring PlayStation 5s for the very first time, and no doubt their parents will purchase Astro Bot along with it. We also know that Sony now has a PC initiative where they release first-party titles onto the PC platform anywhere from 1 to 2 years after release. So we can only assume that the same will happen with Astro Bot, which will push those sales figures further. Basically, 1.5 million isn't huge, but it is huge considering all the other logistics backed behind this project. That sales figure will only increase as we go through 2025. But even right now, with all of the success that Astro Bot has currently generated, yeah, I would say that a sequel is absolutely guaranteed, and we could actually see it as early as 2027. A lot of those assets that were developed for the first game here will be able to be reused, so we may even see a shorter development time of 3 years. But what excites me the most about Astro Bot is the snowball effect that it might have with Sony. A lot of people who grew up with PlayStation still to this day beg Sony to bring back a lot of their old school IPs and ones that revolve around the platforming genre. It was a little while back that Sony were actually saying that they are currently lacking IPs, which left a lot of gamers scratching their heads considering that Sony basically has an IP graveyard full of potential, especially with modern technologies. I can't help but wonder that through the success of Astro Bot, will Sony reconsider bringing back a lot of their old school IPs and ones that actually revolved around platforming. That isn't to say that the platforming genre will become a priority for Sony, because it's still very much apparent that their action, adventure, highly cinematic, open world titles still generate the most money. Using the Sly Cooper series as an example, could this be something that Sony reconsiders to bring back? I don't think they would ever get Sucker Punch back on the project by any means. I think that these old IPs, if they were to be revived, would be handed off to one of their smaller studios, or perhaps maybe outsourced, but with much lower budgets, a much more efficient development time, and the fact that through the success of Astro Bot tells Sony that people still care about this genre, even if it is a brand new IP, we could absolutely see more platforming video games for Sony's pipeline going forward. This is the reason why I wanted to make this video. Not just because, wow, yeah, I had such a fun time with Astro Bot, I'm so happy it won Game of the Year, but the actual impact it could have for not just Sony, but other developers going forward. Naturally, of course, there are also a lot of people that are just straight up not happy that a colorful, fun, friendly, easy to jump into video game won Game of the Year stacked up against the competition. And this is absolutely a case of explain to me that you didn't play Astro Bot without explaining to me that you didn't play Astro Bot. This is a video game that is just so hard to hate. It is pure, simple, fun dopamine. Outside of the nostalgia strings that Astro Bot quite clearly has, it's just a fun-ass video game. It's really as video game as video games get. Genuinely speaking, I actually never thought that I would ever experience another platformer title taking home Game of the Year outside of Mario. And the fact that it's happened this year, especially with something as good as Metaphor, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and Black Myth Wukong, is kind of jaw-dropping. Congrats to Team Asobi on the huge success. I cannot wait to see what the studio decide to do next, whether it do be Astro Bot or something entirely brand new. Either way though, I think that Astro Bot is absolutely here to stay, and will definitely become one of Sony's brand new mascots. Thank you guys so much for tuning into today's video. Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Smash that like button and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much to my wonderful patrons. I appreciate you guys supporting the channel. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, and we'll talk again real soon.